Welcome and thank you for joining us on the 2020 webinar, GIA's Annual Report on Arts and Culture. I'm Sherilyn Seeley, Program Manager for GIA. In the Winter 2020 edition of the GIA Reader, the latest edition of GIA's Funder Snapshot includes Foundation Grants to Arts and Culture from 2017, and then based on the most recent completed year of Candid data, Public Funding for the Arts 2019. Which was prepared by the National Assembly of States Arts Agencies, or NASA. Today, Reina Mukai of Candid, Ryan Stubbs of the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies, and Patricia Mullaney-Loss of the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies have joined us. They will share a summary of key findings and insights into what these findings reveal about the current arts grant-making environment, as well as an introduction to what we can expect for the new year. Reina Mukai joined the research staff of Candid, formerly known as Foundation Center, in 2006. She is the manager of global projects and partnerships at Candid. In this role, she works on a range of research and data-driven projects. Ryan Stubbs is the Senior Director of Research for NASA. He oversees data collection and research services. In this role, he directs NASA's traffic of public funding for the arts and its work as the National Repository of States Arts Agency grant-making data. Patricia Mullaney-Loss is the research manager of NASA. She collects information on States Arts Agency funding levels and sources through the States Arts Agency Revenue Survey and manages NASA's historical funding database. We're glad to have them joining us today. At the very end of the presentation, I'll be joining to facilitate a Q&A. With that, I will turn it over to our presenters. Welcome, Reina, Patricia, and Ryan. Reina, why don't you get us started?
Thanks, Sherilyn, and hi, everyone. So let me advance my slide here. So my presentation today is going to be focusing on trends in foundation funding for arts and culture among a set of the largest U.S. foundations over the last decade. We'll be looking at how arts funding has fared compared to overall giving. We'll look at breakdown of funding to various arts subcategories and also look at arts funding by population served, specifically for Alana communities. But before jumping into the findings, I wanted to provide an overview of our grant sample that much of this data that I'm presenting on is based on. So the set includes all grants of $10,000 or more awarded by the roughly 1,000 largest U.S. foundations by total giving. It accounts for about half of all foundation giving by U.S.-based private and community foundations. And the 2017 grant sample includes 164,000 grants totaling $34.1 billion. I also wanted to just briefly go over how we identify grants for arts and culture funding. So in older snapshot reports prior to 2017, grants were included if they were coded as focusing primarily on the arts. And if a grant activity couldn't be determined by the grant description or didn't have a grant description at all, we would use the activity of the recipient organization, which is based on the mission of the organization. So we now take a broader approach, similar to the way that we capture support strategy and populations served. We look across both primary and secondary purposes if a grant is coded with more than one focus area. We've found that focusing just on the primary code assigned can often be arbitrary and tends to undercount areas of funding. So for example, in this year's set, there was an $8.9 million grant awarded to the Boys and Girls Club in Atlanta to support a youth arts initiative. The goal of the initiative was to help low-income urban youth engage in high-quality arts education programs. So this grant received both an arts education and youth services code. So if the grant had been coded as having a primary focus of youth services, it wouldn't have been included as an arts grant. But using this broader strategy, this grant would be included both as an arts and youth services grant in our analysis. So this figure shows the share of dollars going to arts and culture between 2007 and 2017. So over the past decade, U.S. foundation funding supporting arts and culture has slowly declined as a share of total foundation giving. At its peak in 2007, arts funding accounted for about 12% of overall dollars, and for the last 4 years, the share of arts funding has hovered around 8 or 9%, including the most recent year where arts funding accounted for 8% of overall dollars. The share of number of grants has also declined, but has remained more or less steady for the last several years at around 12% of overall number of grants awarded, although for the most recent year, the share dropped to 11%. The share of arts dollars falling has partly to do with other areas of funding gaining more traction, such as health, particularly around public health, as well as environment-related issues like climate change, which have seen increases in funding over recent years. So this next figure represents the actual dollar amounts awarded for arts and culture by our set of the largest U.S. foundations. And as you can see, prior to 2015, giving for the arts had remained relatively steady at around 2.3 to 2.5 billion. And in 2015 went up to 2.8 billion, an increase of about 300 million. So though there are always large grants included in our sets, there were a number of exceptionally large grants awarded the last few years. In the 2016 set, there were 58 grants of $5 million or more, totaling $750 million. And in the most recent year, there were 57 grants of $5 million or more, totaling $670 million. And the median arts grant has also been higher the last several years, starting with 2015. So prior to 2015, the median grant amount for arts and culture had remained consistent at about $25,000 since the early 1990s. But in 2015, the median art grant was $30,000, and in 2017, it was $27,500. So this next figure represents the change in foundation giving by a matched set of funders between 2016 and 2017. So among a matched subset of 845 funders, grant dollars for the arts was down 1%, compared to an 8% increase in grant dollars overall. The change in number of grants was also down 1% for arts and culture compared to 3% for all giving. And as far as the arts subcategories, historic preservation was the only subcategory that actually saw an increase in funding, which was up 10%. All the other areas within arts saw a 1 to 2% decrease in funding between 2016 and 2017. So next, we'll take a look at the distribution of arts funding by field. Performing arts, which includes everything from dance to theater to music and performing arts education, captured the largest share of arts funding in 2017, accounting for 31% of all arts dollars, or about $874 million. The largest performing arts grant in 2017 was a $59 million grant from the Greater Kansas City Community Foundation to the Kaufman Center for the Performing Arts. Museums captured the second largest share of dollars in 2017, accounting for 27% of all arts dollars, or about $750 million. So in any given year, these two fields capture the largest shares of arts funding, often alternating from one year to the next. So next I'm going to talk a little bit about the distribution of arts funding by types of support. This figure shows the breakdown of giving to the arts by support strategy. So general operating, program, and capital support accounted for the largest shares of grant dollars supporting the arts. General operating support received the largest share of arts grants dollars. The share of grant dollars and the number of grants allocated for this support strategy in 2017 were higher for arts and culture. So you can see here it's 26% and 27%. Than the overall share directed to general operating support, which accounted for roughly 20% of grant dollars and 22% of the number of grants. And the beneficiaries of these large general support dollars tend to be large, well-established art museums and performing arts centers. So program support received the second largest share of arts grant dollars in 2017, capturing 24% of arts dollars and 21% by number of grants. So special programs and projects typically receive one of the largest shares of arts and culture grant dollars, and the same is true actually for most of the other major fields such as health and education, where program support consistently accounts for one of the largest shares of funding. Capital support accounted for the third largest share of arts grant dollars, and similar to general support, the share of grants dollars allocated for this type of support was also higher for arts and culture than for grants overall, 19% versus 8%. Grants for capital support are larger on average than awards for programs and general operating support. And exceptionally large capital grants can have a pronounced effect on the distribution of funding by support strategy. The median grant amount for capital support in 2017 for the arts was $50,000 versus $32,000 for program support and about $25,300 for general operating support. So some of the largest arts grants in 2017 were for endowments, collections, and building and renovations, all of which would be included under capital support. So next I wanted to talk a little bit about arts funding to a lot of communities. And this is not an analysis that we include in the Art Snapshot, but there is interest around tracking funding for this area. And so we've included some of the information we have to share today. But before looking at the data for funding for a lot of communities, I wanted to provide a quick overview of how we assign population coding to our grants data. So you get a sense of how our data is capturing populations served for this type of analysis. So population codes can be assigned at the recipient organization level or to the grant itself based on the grant description. So, excuse me, take for example grants to benefit African Americans. For a grant awarded to an organization whose mission is to serve or benefit African Americans would get the People of African Descent code. Or for a grant that explicitly states in its description that it serves this specific population group would also get that code. But for a grant that references something more general like people of color or the wrongfully incarcerated, while it's likely that African Americans implicitly benefit from these grants, we don't code these grants for African Americans because it isn't explicitly stated in the grant activity. So in that sense, there could be some undercounting with the population analysis. And this is a deliberately conservative methodology that makes no additional assumptions about likely beneficiaries beyond what we can determine by the information provided by the grant description or the mission and activities of a recipient organization. The other thing to note is that we tag population based on beneficiaries as well as cultural institutions related to specified pop groups. So a few examples of the types of grants that might be included in this kind of analysis would be grants awarded to the Studio Museum in Harlan, which is an art museum devoted to the work of artists of African descent, or to the National Museum of African American History and Culture. So that's the National Museum devoted to the documentation of African American life, history, and culture. There are also grants like the one awarded to create a fund to support the Youth Excellence Performing Arts Workshop, which provides arts training for African American youth in Akron. So there are also many grants for which we don't have grant descriptions. Therefore, we wouldn't be able to code it, even if the intention of the grant maker had been to serve a specific population. So keeping this in mind, I wanted to share some analysis we pulled for arts funding going to Alana communities. So this figure shows the share of arts funding allocated for Alana communities between 2007 and 2017. And over the past decade, arts funding for Alana communities looks like it's held steady at around 5 or 7%. But for the last 3 years of available data shows some increase, starting with 2015, where the share of dollars was 8%, and in 2017 it was 10%. So the share of number of arts grants to Alana communities has remained consistent at around 9 to 10% from 2007 to 2017. People of African descent and indigenous peoples were the largest recipients of arts funding by Alana communities the last few years, and this has largely to do with many large grants being awarded to major cultural institutions associated with these populations groups. So if this analysis excluded those types of grants, the shares would likely look very different. So this last slide looks at all U.S. private and community foundation giving from 2008 to 2018. And as you can see, aside from a slight dip in 2009, foundation funding overall has increased steadily. So in 2017, giving by the approximately 86,000 active private and community foundations rose 12% to $77.3 billion and continued to grow in 2018. And as we saw in an earlier slide, among the match set of the largest U.S. foundations included in the 2017 grant set, overall giving was up 8%, although arts and culture funding remained relatively unchanged. So while the share of overall foundation support targeting arts and culture is smaller than what was reported in the early 2000s and prior, arts and culture does continue to rank among the top funding priorities of foundations. Actual art grants dollars are likely to grow along with overall foundation giving, but what remains unclear is whether arts funding will continue to remain a priority as funders rethink their giving strategies and new funders emerge. So there is an influx of large new funders entering the space, and we'll need to take a closer look at these new funders to study if their giving will shift the funding landscape. So that's the end of my presentation. So I'm going to hand it over to Reina and Patricia to talk about public funding for the arts. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Reina. Very enlightening presentation, and hello to everyone. We are happy to be here today to discuss public funding for the arts in 2019. Our role today is to focus on data trends in public funding and public grant making in the arts, and we'll start with the trends as they were published in the Winter 2020 GIA Reader. We'll then provide a few funding updates regarding those trends, and we'll touch on how the public funding ecosystem works. And so with that, I'll hand things over to Patricia to get us started.
Great, thanks Ryan. First, let me tell you a bit about the sources of public funding on the arts we'll be talking about today, and then from there I'll share a little bit more on how much government funders spend on the arts and how these sources of funding have trended over time. So public funding for the arts is best understood by tracking three key sources: congressional allocations to the National Endowment for the Arts, legislative appropriations to the nation's state arts agencies, and funds allocated by local governments to local arts agencies. So during this presentation, I'll reference appropriations to the National Endowment for the Arts. That's the total budget that Congress approves for the Arts Endowment. We'll talk a lot about legislative appropriations to state arts agencies. NASA collects these data twice a year through our state arts agency appropriations and revenue surveys. This includes state appropriated dollars only. It does not include non-appropriated state dollars, federal or private funds. The third layer is local funding. This information comes from Americans for the Arts. We'll look at the total figures for local government dollars going to local arts agencies, with estimates based on the local arts agency census. So as Ryan mentioned, I'll share data published in the winter edition of the GIA Reader, which looks at public funding for fiscal year 2019. We'll then take a look at new fiscal year 2020 data for federal and state governments. So you're really getting a great bundled deal in this webinar. I'll go through each layer of funding separately, and we'll combine layers to get the total government funding for the arts in 2019. So let's start with the National Endowment for the Arts. In 2019, the total appropriation for the endowment was $155 million. You see that that is a bit less than the 20-year high of $168 million in 2010, using nominal dollars. Unfortunately, that 20-year high is not the all-time high. The all-time high for the endowment was $176 million back in 1992, so that's over 28 years ago. So in FY 2019, state arts agencies received about $360 million from state government appropriations. This was a slight increase over the previous fiscal year, but far below the all-time high of $449 million back in 2001. So if you need reminding, that was almost 2 decades ago. Again, in 2019, local appropriations for the arts were estimated to remain flat at $860 million. You can see that this is the second year local arts agencies have maintained the highest level of funding in the past 20 years. I'd also like to say that this information is pretty difficult to measure, simply because there are an estimated 4,500 local arts agencies across the country, and there isn't a feasible mechanism for tracking all of them each year. However, Americans for the Arts, local arts agency census, help to recalibrate these data. They do that every few years, last one being in 2018. And they also track data from the largest local arts agencies to help them update estimates on a yearly basis. So if you add up all three funding streams, federal, state, and local governments appropriated a combined $1.38 billion to the arts in fiscal year 2019. $1.38 billion sounds like a significant amount, but if we think about that number in terms of total government spending or in an economic context, $1.38 billion becomes pretty small when you change your perspective. For example, at the national level, the endowment's budget represents about 0.04% of 1% of all federal spending. That is 0.004%. At the state level, state arts agency appropriations represent about 0.05% of total state spending. Also, we know from the National Endowment and the Bureau of Economic Analysis that arts and cultural production accounts for $804 billion of GDP, which is equal to 4.3% of the U.S. economy. So by any fair comparisons, public investment for the arts is extremely modest. So how did public arts fare in FY 2020? Given that we have current FY 2020 data at the federal and state level, we can start to piece together trends for this current fiscal year. As a reminder, funding levels are always a moving target as governments make mid-year changes to budgets, and so these figures will continue to shift. Now at the federal level, the endowment received a $7 million increase in 2020 with the passage of the federal spending bill, making the endowment's 2020 appropriation $162 million. This is great news, marking the 6th year of budget increase, and I know many of you listening to this webinar deserve credit for your continued advocacy efforts, establishing solid public support for the arts, just in the general public and also in Congress. Public funding for the arts sustains support that transcends the political spectrum, and that is definitely needed as the President's budget for FY 2021 was recently released, and yet again it proposes an elimination of the National Endowment for the Arts as well as other cultural agencies. This, coupled with considerable uncertainty going forward with international trade tension and fears of another recession, means that arts advocates like yourselves must maintain efforts to work with and educate Congress to ensure the endowment has continued wide support. Also, just a quick update on the local arts agency funding landscape. Americans for the Arts has not yet released FY 2020 figures yet, and it is unclear whether funding will remain constant, increase, or decrease. But we do now have data for state arts agencies. Aggregate appropriations to SAAs have reached an all-time high in FY 2020, an increase of 37.3% from FY 2019. So they reached about $494 million this fiscal year. Much of this increase is due to line items passing through state arts agencies. Excluding line items, however, appropriations still increased by 14.5%. So this comes in conjunction with many states seeing more robust revenue growth. Entering a third year of stable growth, states are experiencing favorable budgetary conditions, and consequently most states are increasing spending in FY 2020. So this holds true when we take a closer look at the changes between FY 2019 and FY 2020. We see a majority of states or state arts agencies did experience an increase or maintain flat funding. 42 states are increasing with a median increase of 9.5%. Another 8 states are remaining flat. And 6 states are receiving budget cuts with a median decrease of 8.9%. So I think it's helpful to put this in a little bit more context by adjusting for inflation. This chart gives you a better sense of how much inflation diminishes the power of the dollar. Even when considering the state and federal nominal gains in FY 2020, the value of each appropriated dollar has not been constant over time. State arts agencies are experiencing all-time nominal high, but funding has actually decreased by 23.8% since 2001 when accounting for inflation. Now, there are a lot of struggling organizations out there, and the cost of doing business is constantly rising. If public funding isn't at least keeping up with inflation, that means a more difficult environment for artists and arts organizations, and fewer culture experiences for the general population. This funding environment makes it more difficult for the public to benefit from the economic, civic, health, and educational benefits of the arts. So another contextual factor is per capita funding. Combined, federal, state, and local arts agencies, their funding yielded a per capita investment of $4.50 per person. This per capita calculation is really important when we measure public funding because that money originates from all taxpayers, and it is meant to benefit all residents. So the number of communities and individuals public funding can reach is important to consider. As populations grow, public arts agencies need to serve more people. So consistent budget growth is not only necessary to keep up with inflation, but it's also necessary to keep up with a growing nation. This chart shows that population growth, represented by the red line, is pretty consistent. The public funding for the arts is anything but. So with that, I will turn it back over to Ryan. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Patricia. So now that we know the relative levels of funding and the trends that we're seeing, I want to talk a little bit about how different levels of government grant makers are interconnected, including the National Endowment for the Arts. The endowment, state arts agencies, and local arts agencies are all connected with real dollars. 40% of the National Endowment for the Arts program budget goes to state arts agencies, and about 13% of state arts agency grant dollars go directly to local arts agencies. But those partnerships and those dollars are matched at every level, leveraging many more funds and contributing to a system of support for the arts in the United States. This diagram attempts to illustrate how resources and knowledge move through the system. At each level of government, funds go directly to arts organizations and artists through grants. Those funds are then matched by private support and other funds. Additionally, as I mentioned, 40% of endowment partnership agreements go to, or of endowment program funds go to state arts agencies, which regrant those dollars to many different types of institutions. Some of these dollars are also regranted at the local level. Regranting helps support public infrastructure for grant making in the arts and assures that those closest to the ground are making funding decisions. Another part of this diagram is the leadership role that the endowment plays in building the sector in terms of knowledge and programs. Through federal priorities, this leadership filters through every level of government. For example, the National Endowment for the Arts catalyzes cross-sector work through programs such as Creative Forces supporting arts and military, and Our Town supporting creative placemaking, and they also contribute to research to understand these cross-sector benefits, arts participation, and the value of arts and cultural production. The connectivity of funding and leadership helps different levels of government learn from each other, and that knowledge flows both from federal to local and from local to federal. So knowing how these systems currently work is important, but it's also important to know who benefits from the system. A large part of these investments go to underserved communities. Public dollars don't only follow large cultural institutions in big cities, they prioritize communities that need them. For example, 14% of National Endowment for the Arts grants have a rural component. 64% go to organizations that are small or smaller sized organizations. We know that 42% of local arts agencies require that grantees demonstrate some form of diversity. And we also know that 60% of state arts agency awards go to counties with median incomes below the national median. So one way NASA has been trying to better understand how public funds reach different communities is by looking at state arts agency grants relative to some of the underlying county demographics. In this example, we see that 75% of Americans live in counties where people of color make up more than 1/5 of the population. And here we're saying 1/5 of the population because that's the national median for populations of color by county. So this isn't a perfect measurement, but it is one way to look at places that have relatively more people of color when compared to the nation. Because we have data on the location of state arts agency grantees, when we look at the distribution of state arts agency awards, we see that 76% of these awards are going to counties with relatively more people of color, and an even greater percentage of grant dollars go to those counties. So we can't really infer much beyond this other than the fact that state arts agencies, that their grants seem to be following population patterns, but it does suggest some parity of public arts funding and populations of color when looking nationwide. Also, serving people living in all geographies is an especially important purpose of public funding. Public funders tend to fund smaller award sizes and distribute them in more places. For example, state arts agencies have a median award value of $5,000. The median award amount from the National Endowment for the Arts is $20,000, but 57% of all of endowment awarded grants are less than $25,000 in size. And as we heard from Reina, the majority of foundation awards coming from at least the largest foundations are above $27,000. So the imperative to reach many types of organizations in diverse areas across states with a limited amount of funding is one factor affecting public agency award size decisions. As expected, we do see evidence of public funders reaching more rural areas. State arts agencies receive, they award 21% of their grants to rural areas, while 18% of the U.S. population lives in rural areas. As we mentioned at the federal level, 14% of the NEA's grant-funded activities have a rural component, meaning they serve a rural area in some way. And we know that the National Endowment for the Arts funds, they reach 779 more counties than the top 1,000 private foundation awards do. Funding economically disadvantaged communities is another important aspect of public sector grant making. From our data, we know that 24% of state arts agency grantees report directly serving individuals below the poverty line, and 27% of all state arts agency dollars support programs for people living in poverty. As a comparison, census data tells us that 15% of the national population is living below the poverty line. Now for a few comparisons related to the size and distribution of awards across sectors. This chart shows the number of grants by dollar size for the National Endowment for the Arts, foundations, and state arts agencies. Keep in mind that this chart does not include foundation grants below $10,000, so it's not that they don't exist, they're just not shown in the chart. And this chart reiterates the fact that public funders focus on a greater number of smaller awards, but I also think it illustrates how the different sectors are serving different needs and that all players within this cultural funding ecosystem are necessary. The demand for funding certainly outpaces the supply, but demand comes in many forms for many different types of organizations and different populations. So both public and private investments in the arts are necessary to undergird democratized arts experiences in America. Now there's much more information available on public sector grant making available on our websites. So here is some information on where you can find more data and research around state arts agency grants, local arts agency awards, and National Endowment and the National Endowment for the Arts. And with that, I think I will hand things back to Sherilyn for questions.
Awesome. Thank you both, all three of you, for sharing. That was great. I liked the bundle deal, Patricia, that you named earlier. That was really helpful, and lots of snaps and excitement for the increase in the budget for public funding. And thank you both for also calling out specific communities. Sort of disaggregating that data is always helpful so we can see what's happening. Because all places are, of course, very different, and some are touched more by foundation giving, others by public funding. So thank you for all of that. And right now we will switch it over to the Q&A with our presenters. Remember to ask your questions in the rectangular text box to the bottom of your screen, and remember to address your question to a specific presenter if necessary. So the first question I will direct to you, Reina. So just kind of going back to, you mentioned that there are more funders sort of popping up in the field, which is really exciting. Hopefully we do see things change in the way that funding, arts and culture funding, is looking in terms of increasing. But I'd like to see what arts funding looks like beyond what the largest funders are doing. So does Candid collect data on smaller or medium-sized funders, not just the largest ones?
Yes, that's a great question. We do collect data on smaller and medium-sized funders outside of this, excuse me, FC 1000 set that I referenced. And as we've kind of automated our process in recent years around collecting and indexing grants level data, we do have more and more data from these funders. For the arts snapshot, we've always used this FC 1000 set because this is a report that we provide annually, and we track trends like kind of year over year, and using a consistent set makes for better analysis. But we can think about the pros and cons of expanding the set to include a larger set of funders. Certainly, including a larger set of funders, represents more dollars in the space. But it's harder to do that kind of year-over-year analysis because, you might see dollars going up because not so much because more arts funding, not so much because arts funding is growing, but because we just have more data. So, but certainly we've done that, and I think that's a great point. So definitely something to think about for like future webinars and certainly for the arts snapshot.
Yeah, and then just one follow-up question. Can you speak specifically, for you, Reina, specifically about grants below $10,000 and why you do or don't?
So historically, we used to basically collect and index these grants manually. So it was a completely manual process where I think prior to like the 2014 data, we were getting tax returns or having grants reported to us directly from foundations, and we had a large group of indexers at, formerly Foundation Center, reading through grants and basically manually indexing them. And so, it was a capacity issue. I think at that point we were indexing annually around, I would say, like 250,000 grants or so. And a lot of it focused sort of around the largest funders and the largest grants, just because it's sort of more, bang for your buck, I guess. But now we have changed our collection and indexing, and we have sort of, machine learning algorithms kind of coding grants based on how historically our grants have been coded. And while we do review the largest grants, a lot of them are just kind of auto-coded, so we're able to process more grants. But yes, historically, the reason why the focus has been on grants of $10,000 or more and sort of by this larger set is just because it was much more manual, and it just requires a lot of work for someone to go through, read the grant descriptions, code it for like the proper, classification codes that we use to code these grants so that we can run these types of analyses.
Sure. Yeah, I can imagine it's not a 5-minute task, so I don't.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. So I'm going to kick it over to Reina and Patricia. A question for you about your data. So is the data shown in your presentation, does it encapsulate all of the arts-related government funding, or are there other ways that government support the arts that is not included in what you presented?
Sure, I can take this one. So the funders that we're talking about today are public arts grant makers. So these are dollars that filter directly to arts organizations, to artists and communities from the public sector. So we're not talking about other things that the public sector certainly supports that aren't necessarily counted in here, such as tax advantages for nonprofit organizations, other federal investments that might go to the Smithsonian or things like military bands, or similar institutional support that might not go through arts agencies. So some of those things are there, and they could possibly counted, but could possibly be counted. But there's also something important to say about empowering the field through the existence of the state, local, and federal arts agencies.
Okay. So then, follow-up question, just in terms of, that was very helpful. in terms of the breakdown, one of our attendees wants to know if you break down the data based on red or blue states and funding based on governing party. Is that something that you do at all?
Yeah, so we actually have done some of this analysis. And one thing that we have published before is just the trend of funding going to the National Endowment for the Arts based on the makeup of Congress and who held the office of president. So when you look at that chart, you don't really see many differences between at least support for the arts at the federal level, depending on who is in power in Congress and who holds the presidency. So there's not much correlation there. We've also done some more in-depth analysis of how this breaks down on a state-by-state level to see if a particular party alignment resulted in greater appropriations for the arts in that particular state. We also, in that analysis, saw very little correlation between a particular party alignment as well as a particular party alignment and increased arts appropriations in the state. So we have taken some look at that. Nothing that we can point you towards online on our site, but generally what we've found is very little correlation between party alignment and funding for the arts.
Okay, very helpful. Next question is going to Reina. So there's a figure that you presented in your data earlier on in the set. I think it was your first or second slide. And so one of our attendees is wondering if the figure 164,000, here I can bring us there just so folks know. If the figure 164,000 includes grants and Foundation Center 1000, so the name of the data set from 2017, or in the Foundation directory online. So I'm going to keep clicking here, but you can go ahead and.
Okay, yep. So that figure, the 164,000, is from our what we call the FC 1000. So that's our research set. So the grants of $10,000 or more awarded by like the roughly 1,000 largest U.S. like private and community foundations. The total dollar figures that you would see, in our online tool, Foundation Directory Online, for 2017 would be much higher than that, only because it includes obviously funders beyond that 1,000. It includes, obviously grants under $10,000 as well, and depending on like how you, query the database, like it also includes grants awarded by like grant-making public charities, like a United Ways, or like a Robin Hood Foundation. Like grant-making public charities aren't included. I mean, community foundations are included in the set, but like aside from community foundations, grant-making public charities aren't included in the set. So the figures are different.
Thank you for that. And then kind of similar question, but not identical, though it is coming your way, Ryan and Patricia. So do you track, Reina, do you track funding by region? Thinking about sort of like distribution by state or rural areas, communities. You called out a lot of communities specifically, but now in terms of region.
Yes. I mean, we do provide regional analysis. It's a little bit more complicated. We can certainly provide regional analysis based on, let's say, like where the recipients are located. So that would just be purely address, and we've done it that way. Some grant makers will provide additional information within their grant. So for example, like they might be awarding a grant to like a big national organization, but that's based in, let's say, like DC or New York. But really that money is going to be used elsewhere. If a grant maker provides that information, we can capture that. But if they don't provide that information, and not all grant makers do, we're not able to include that. So like I think in that sense, you know, like New York, DC, like even California, like tend to look a little inflated because we're not able to capture sort of that nuance.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, you can sort of only run an analysis on the data that you are provided, so makes sense. And I think
exactly.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. Okay. Yeah. And then so Ryan and Patricia. Okay. Ryan and Patricia, you did actually go in a bit into rural areas, rural communities, Alana communities, and sort of break that down a bit. But kind of shifting gears out of region, actually, can you share any information, if you have any, on how arts education is funding by state arts agencies?
Hey, sure, this is Ryan. I can take that one as well. Yeah, that's something that we didn't talk about in the presentation this year, but it is something that is tracked within the data, and it's also within, I believe there is definitely some information with regards to National Endowment for the Arts funds and local arts agency investments in arts education. But the data that I have on hand is from state arts agencies. So again, we're looking at all state arts agency awards in each year. Those awards are coded if for arts education, if a primary amount of their activities are focused on arts education. So as you can imagine, there are a lot of awards that are out there that have some sort of arts education component. We're not counting all of that. We're counting the awards for which arts education was a primary part of the grant. And so grantees code that as an arts education award if it is. And so when we look at those data, we know that over $80 million that are coming from state arts agencies are going for arts education awards. That makes up 26% of all state arts agency grant dollars, and it's actually 45% of all state arts agency awards at over 9,000 awards. So it is a very important function of state arts agencies to support arts education, as it also is for the National Endowment for the Arts, and there's also many local arts agencies involved with funding arts education. So yeah, that's the information that we have.
Helpful. So Reina, I want to kick it back to you a bit as we still got some time, so feel free to keep sending your questions. You mentioned in your presentation, and I sort of called this out as well right before Q&A, that there are more funders sort of popping up in the field. And so one of our attendees is wondering if you can describe that trend a bit. If you're tracking any of those new funders, are you focusing on their giving? Is there anything that you can share about new folks coming into the field?
Hi. Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have anything to share readily right now, but certainly when we put these sort of FC 1000 sets together, we always kind of do a general scan, and there have been sort of larger new foundations coming in, and certainly we do look at them periodically, and I will look at sort of like the new funders to see if they are shifting the landscape. It's hard to tell, I think, without having more recent data. Our data has lagged about 2 years, but I'm hoping within the next few years we have sort of more information on that, because I think it is really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I too hope that we'll see a positive change in the future with all of the new funders who are joining in. And so, are there any final thoughts that either of you want to share, all three of you, as we come to the close of the webinar? you hearing me? Okay. I'll ask the question again. I'm wondering if there are, oh, it stopped. Okay. I'm wondering if there are any final thoughts that you have, Reina, Patricia, or Ryan, for the folks who are joining us today, and share as closing thoughts.
Sure. Yeah, you had mentioned earlier, and I had kind of alluded to it, our analysis is really only as good as what the information that we have. So, I don't know if there are a lot of sort of funders on this call, but we always encourage funders to, report their grants to us, and or, when they're reporting their grants, providing sort of like as much information as possible so that we are able to use that information and code grants appropriately. I know that, sort of like this funding around Alana communities, there's been a lot of interest around it, and we kind of struggle with the population served because we do think that with better information, we will be able to capture that more accurately. We kind of do the best that we can with the information available. But like I said, when there's no grant description, there's no way for us to kind of allocate those dollars to, the appropriate issue areas or population served. So.
Great.
Yeah, I would say, and just to build on that, it is interesting to think about the ways in which we collect data across different sectors, across different levels of government, and that our data are not always perfect. Fortunately, the methods of federal data collection from the National Endowment for the Arts and state arts agencies has been in place for quite some time with a standard taxonomy for collecting certain fields. So we have this sort of good set of long-term data, but it's certainly not perfect, and it gets updated every so often. And I think there has been an effort to try and provide some guidance so that agencies of all types can better report on who's benefiting and the types of organizations receiving the awards and which communities those awards are going to. I think, as technology advances, we have better ways of, inputting data, encoding data, and then analyzing data through different software platforms. But it's still just as good as the amount that people are willing to collect. And we also don't want to create too much burden on those organizations, many of which are small, that are trying to do the input of data and often don't have the capacity or experience to do it. So there's lots of challenges, but I think it would behoove everyone for sort of all sectors to continue to work together and find better ways of collecting the data that we need and telling the story that we need.
Great. All right. Well, if there is nothing else, I want to say another thank you to all three of you for presenting today, Ryan, Patricia, and Reina. If there are any questions that you all have, attendees, in follow-up, we have provided their contact info for your convenience. And also, today's presentation has been recorded. We'll be sending you a link to this file and the presentation slides within the next few days, and we invite you to take a brief survey that we'll share immediately following the webinar. Your feedback is very important to us, and it helps us design future webinars. So if you have further questions, you can feel free to reach out to me, Sherilyn Seeley, and thank you for joining us. Have a great day.
Thanks, folks.
Thank you.